When Russia goes into space, they launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome out in the middle of Kazakhstan. It's essentially an ocean of grass. The Europeans launch from the jungle deep in what used to be French Guiana. The Americans launch from Cape Kennedy, where spent rockets fall down harmlessly into the Atlantic Ocean, and a great deal of care is taken to make sure that there are no vehicles, no ships out in the potential landing area. But China has 3 launch sites, and since launch sites need to be as close to the equator as possible to use the rotation of the Earth to help, China is not particularly careful about where they put their launch sites. All 3 of their Chinese launch sites have population centers downstream. As the rocket climbs into space, the first stage falls down. In America, it falls into the ocean. In European launches, it falls into the jungle. In Russian launches, it falls into the empty steppes. But in China, it falls down on population centers. And I've known this for a long time, but yesterday I saw a piece of footage taken by somebody's handheld camera where you see the first stage booster of the Chinese Long March rocket falling from the sky, and what used to sound like just plain meanness is absolutely terrifying when you see it with your own eyes, as you can see here. The rocket impacted just over the ridge from the guy who did the original filming. This giant red cloud, blood red cloud of smoke you see, is nothing but toxic, fatal chemicals from hyperbolic propellants, and it landed not too far from a Chinese school. So I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and today we're going to talk about the psychology of a country and the ethics of a country that could do something like that. Scott, I was thinking about this, and it seems absolutely heartless. I think you watched the recovery of the Dragon capsule not too long ago from its first manned mission, and if you did watch it, those of you that didn't, the capsule was bobbing out at sea for a significant amount of time. They got it up on deck. They put it down in its cradle. The guys wanted to come out of the capsule. They'd been gone for quite a long time, but they had little sniffers there, and they said, we're detecting a couple of molecules per million more than we like, so we're going to vent it for a while. And then they vented it again, and then finally, even though the boat's in the ocean traveling at a distance, fresh air washing over the deck, they finally decreed it was safe. What do you say about people who knowingly, completely understanding that there are people downstream of their rocket launch? What do you say about a country that simply allows its boosters to fall among villages and let the boosters fall where they may?
Yeah, that SpaceX Dragon capsule recovery nearly killed my phone battery. I was out by the lake watching that thing on my phone. Yeah, and I was like, come on now, how bad can it be? Look, there are other guys on the boat. But that extraordinary measure of caution, and it's not that the United States in its space program hasn't made mistakes and done stupid things that risked people's lives and actually cost people lives, but there's a cavalierness that the Chinese Communist Party has about its own people. And I even when I say the phrase its own people, like, I don't really think they think of them that way. It's not their own people. They're just the people, the masses of people out there. And there's no sense of importance of the individual in that culture. And therefore, any number of people that have to die because of the convenience of putting a rocket launching base where they want to have it is a price worth paying as far as they're concerned, because they don't know any of those people. What difference does it make? It's like the Chinese, if it weren't so tragic, if it weren't so deadly, it would be comic. Because it's like they're like the hapless character in a Looney Tunes cartoon that's constantly trying to do something to keep up and just can't keep up and winds up looking ridiculous over and over again. What they haven't figured out is that they're trying to short circuit a process that they think is about technology, but it's not about technology. It's about humanity. It's about liberty. It's about the idea of the uniqueness and the importance and the sanctity of the individual human life. And until they're willing to adopt that approach to their science, they'll never catch up. They may launch rockets and they may actually get to the moon and they may actually get to Mars, but they'll always be playing this eternal game of always being behind the Americans. I met a guy at a Thanksgiving dinner once that my church back in Pennsylvania used to do for foreign students over the break when it was Thanksgiving break, because everybody left college, but these foreign students, for the most part, didn't leave. They were still there. And so they had a Thanksgiving dinner for them. And I was sitting next to this guy from China and having a conversation with him. And he was talking about how hard he had worked to make sure that he could get into Lehigh University. And I looked at him, and he was an engineer, of course. And I looked at him and I said, there are lots of universities in China, aren't there? And he said, yeah, they have many universities. And I said, well, wouldn't it have been much easier just to get into a Chinese university? You wouldn't have to leave your family. You wouldn't have to go halfway around the world. You wouldn't have to be isolated at a time such as this. And he just looked at me as if I were insane. Like, how could you not understand why it's better to go to Lehigh University than any of the hundreds, if not thousands, of universities in China? Because there is something that you get here almost in the water, in the air. There is something inherently dignified about being an American engineer. And that's because the most important thing isn't the math. The most important thing isn't the science. The most important thing is the person.
Steve, before I get to you, I just want to add something to what Scott said. Scott, one of the signal honors of my life is having gotten to be good friends with Burt Rutan. And Burt Rutan went to visit the Soviet Union back when it was still the Soviet Union. Burt was an aircraft designer. He ran into one of the top Russian aircraft designers. They got to be friends over drinks and so on. And during the course of the evening, he said to the translator, he said, so what's your personal dream? You know, what do you want to do? And the translator looked at Burt funny. He said, just what's his dream? I want to know what his dream is. They translated it to him, and the designer was flummoxed. Do you want to know are you asking me what I dreamed about last night? No. What do you want to do with your life? He had the concept didn't exist.
Wow.
There was no concept of it. It wasn't like he had a future that he wanted to achieve. He was a brilliantly talented aircraft designer, and his job is to fit into the gears and the cogs in the factory in which he was inserted. Steve, I just finished last year a 4-part series on the space race, Apollo 11, what we saw, and a 13-part series on the Cold War. One of the things that I noticed so consistently through both of those series was just how, Scott had the word exactly, just so cavalier, how uncaring the Soviet Union was when it came to individual human lives, as long as it got a technological achievement and was able to show the United States that they were able to do what we could do. And I came to the conclusion, which is not going to be a new shock for anybody, that all of this was driven by an overwhelming sense of inferiority complex, and a desire to prove that we're as good or better than you are, no matter what the cost. Another collective government, North Korea, decided in the 70s and 80s as South Korea began to really just grow like crazy. They were more or less the same for the 50s and 60s. But when South Korea really started to take off, I think it was Kim Jong-il decided, well, we can't have all the skyscrapers down there in South Korea. We need to have one of our own. And so they created, I think it's called the Rangyang Hotel, international winner of the ugliest building ever constructed. But it is absolutely enormous. It is absolutely huge. Built in the center of downtown Pyongyang in order to demonstrate that North Korea was just as capable of building skyscrapers as South Korea. The actual pouring of the Pyramid of Doom was accomplished. A construction crane was put on the top of the building, and if my memory serves correctly, once they ran out of money to finish the hotel, that construction crane sat on top of this naked concrete structure for, I think, 16 years.
That sounds about right. Yeah, I was pulling the pictures up on Wikipedia earlier.
Finally, just a few years ago, I want to say around 2014-15 or so, Kim Jong, one of the Kim Jongs, decided that this is embarrassing. They hired an Egyptian firm to come in and put glass facing on the building, which they did. And now it's still ugly, but it looks like a modern skyscraper. But if you go inside, there's nothing. When I say nothing, I don't mean like there's the rugs are down, but there's no finishing. There's no carpet. There's no electricity. It is a concrete hollow shell. They have since put a bunch of LEDs up there that can show patriotic messages, but it's kind of, Steve, to me, that hotel is the perfect metaphor for these socialist governments. It is flashy on the outside, designed to look exactly like you would see in the West, and it's got the LED displays and all the rest of it, but inside it is an actual, genuine, monumental tomb. And furthermore, it costs the North Korean people 2% of their GDP every year it was in existence to build and maintain it. People starved to death to create this hollow, ugly, shiny thing to impress the rest of the world that they're just as advanced as the West is.
You know, it's a Potemkin skyscraper, which you wouldn't even think would be a possible thing. And yet there it stands, all 105 ugly ass stories of it. It's really a tribute to the ego of a communist dictator. Oh, and it's so hideous. You know, Field of Dreams is a beautiful movie, but there's a big fat lie that everybody knows in that movie. Build it and they will come. They won't. Listen, the reason why New York City is filled with skyscrapers is that people who can afford to live in skyscrapers want to live in New York. And so developers build skyscrapers, and then the people who could afford to live in the skyscrapers move into the skyscrapers because they can. They want to. The demand has to come first. And you build that demand by setting a people free, or I should more properly say by respecting their inherent freedom and letting them live their lives and pursue their dreams. You don't do it by robbing the people blind in order to build this huge tribute to some Kim Jong's ego, while the actual people are starving. And in North Korea lost, we estimate 2 or 3 million people to famine in the 90s, which is when this project was started. They lost about 10% of their population. It's just awful. And the survivors, by the way, are several inches shorter on average than South Koreans. And far weaker physically. Ace of Spades, the blogger, wrote a beautiful piece a few years ago about the Dirk Diggler effect. And this is going to be a real concern as some of these communist regimes start to age and become more brittle, as communist regimes do. You may remember it's probably my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson movie. His second film is called Boogie Nights, came out in the late 90s. And it follows the rise and fall of Dirk Diggler, this young porn star. And at first he's making all the money and, you know, he buys the flashiest Corvette you could possibly buy. But of course, he's Dirk Diggler, so all the money ends up going up his nose. And you flash forward a year and the Corvette is beat up, the smashed in taillight and all the rest, and he and his buddy are actually trying to push start it. And Ace's theory was that you can give Dirk Diggler all the money in the world, but at heart, he's still just this tiny little kind of corrupt porn star who's going to piss it all away somehow and end up driving a beater, even if it did used to be a brand new flashy Corvette. And that's what's going to happen here in North Korea. It's what's going to happen in China. They can build all these skyscrapers. They can build the Three Gorges Dam and all the rest. But as soon as the money starts to run dry, what happens to these colossal constructs that require all of this maintenance just to remain standing?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Folks, just in the course of listening to Steve talk, I realized he's actually put his finger on what I think should be the official American view of China. China is a Potemkin skyscraper. That's exactly what it is. The technology they used to launch those rockets, the technology they used to build the buildings, the technology for their chips and their fighter planes, all of it was stolen from the West, mostly from America. And when I say stolen, I don't mean borrowed it was just plain stolen. It was just stolen. What China is doing now is what the Soviet Union was trying to do in the 50s and 60s. They are trying to sprint their way through a marathon. And what I mean by that is they're willing to get a very quick short-term gain, and it will cost them in the long term. They can sprint ahead of the American marathon runner, or at least keep up with them for a while, but they don't have the endurance because they don't have the foundation. A country that allows its booster rockets to fill with poison chemicals to fall among schools is not a country that's going to be spending an awful lot of money on safety things or coming up with the technology needed to bring that booster back and land it the way that a bunch of private citizens have in America when SpaceX is done consistently. And furthermore, the Chinese are not prepared to have the incredible number of failures that SpaceX had in order to get there. Public failures on television, rockets exploding, rockets falling off the boat, rockets coming down and they're not willing to do that. They don't have the confidence. All they have is an inferiority complex. So I just wanted to talk about this story because it is a great example of why I have never, ever feared the Chinese as competitors to the United States of America. Never. It's not a question of where they are technologically. It's a question of how they think about things like their people, what's important. And as long as you're a country that's driven by an inferiority complex, you will do anything to catch up to the person you feel inferior to. You'll never develop the foundations. You'll never develop the base. The Chinese say they're going to Mars. I just don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is very simple. Since they don't care about their people, they're not going to have the people to save them. When Apollo 12 left the pad, it got hit by lightning once and it got hit by lightning again. Everything shut down. They had no guidance, nothing. They were just about to pull the escape capsule off the top and try and save the crew when one guy decided to say, tell him to switch SCE to aux. A switch that was never used in training. He had seen one time, he remembered, and one controller had the authority to tell the flight director, tell them to switch SCE to aux, and they went and switched the switch and the power came on and Apollo 12 went and landed on the moon. You cannot create a society that has that kind of a dynamic from people who don't care about their people, from people who allow their rockets to fall on villages and schools. You simply can't do it. It's inconceivable that the men that were in the control room for the Apollo missions and the men and women that are in the control rooms for the SpaceX missions, it is inconceivable for me to think that they would launch a rocket knowing that there was any chance that it would come down and land on human beings. And therein lies the difference, which is why I think the people that say that the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century are wrong. I think 21st century is going to be the American century. And as long as we continue to care about our people, and as long as individuals are allowed to raise their hand and say, no, try this, it's going to be American centuries all the way down. That's the way I see it. This program is made possible by the members at BillWhittle.com, and we say it every time, and you know we're tired of hearing it. It's automatic for you right now. But honestly, if you've been watching the shows and appreciate them, we really need you to help us pay for them because lots of people watch them and don't. And these messages aren't free. We live in a world where things cost money. So we'd love to have you be a member. Just go over to BillWhittle.com and press the big green button. I'm Bill Whittle for Steve Green and Scott Ott. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week right here on Right Angle.